do you have most of the trouble from? Is it white policemen or black policemen?
Black policemen.
It was John Fry who gave Jeff Fort's gang a home. John Fry was the minister at the First Presbyterian Church of Woodlawn, and he let the Blackstone Rangers use his church as their base of operation.
In your judgment, Jeff Fort has never committed any act that would be considered wrong, reprehensible, illegal, unethical?
Well, in my judgment, we'll be in paradise together.
Welcome to a restatement of Black history. Tonight, we're going to restate the history of the Blackstone Rangers. In the name of Almighty Allah, the most merciful, we greet you with the universal salutation of peace. Assalamu alaikum. Wa alaikum assalam.
It's time for us to face the truth and level with each other. It's time for us to face the fact that every brother ain't a brother. Is the cat a brother who shoots a brother and thinks that makes him bad? Is the cat a brother who says he's black because it's now the fad? We're at the point in the world today for self-evaluation, just to find out where we really are in this racially torn up nation. And you know, one of the first things that we must do is to stop killing one another and get on the case of realizing that every brother ain't a brother.
Fire and Blackstone, 1969.
It's getting to be a real sick problem with people that's constantly trying to use us as some political football. These people are constantly trying to frame me and everything.
Our position was very clear from the very beginning, that we weren't interested in being social workers dealing with all the bad things that they were involved in. We were interested in teaching that leadership to do positive things out in the community.
Our main goal at the beginning was to diffuse the violence, begin some positive alternatives, and to accept the reality of the organized structure that the gangs have and try to direct it in a positive and constructive way. And obviously that became very controversial.
At the same time that John Fry was reaching out to the Blackstone Rangers, Arthur Brazier of the Apostolic Church of God had just become the head of the fledgling Woodlawn organization. Brazier's contribution was to get, despite the objections of Mayor Richard J. Daley, a federal grant worth $1 million. The idea was to use the money to teach both the Blackstone Rangers and the Eastside Disciples job skills, and to use the leadership of those gangs to help run the program.
Racial change, economic change, cultural change, and whatever other change you want to mention, and it was happening very rapidly.
In the midst of that changing neighborhood, then, came the gangs.
They grew out of that turmoil.
John Fry, meanwhile, would argue the gangs were not the problem in Woodlawn, society was.
I think that it is really society that is killing black people.
John Fry today has a ministry out in Oregon. He declines to speak about the 1960s Jeff Fort or Woodlawn.
On being called to the First Presbyterian Church of Chicago in June of 1965, I used my first weeks in the city to have a look at the immediate parish. I walked up and down the streets and alleys of Woodlawn, talking to the citizens, just getting the feel of the place. My eyes were stunned by what was coming at me. The name of the place should be Blackstone Rangers and not Woodlawn. The children sang, "Mighty, Mighty Blackstone," as they played in the streets. Graffiti on the walls of buildings, on underpasses, on street signs attested to the presence of various Blackstone Ranger clubs. Apache Rangers, Maniac Rangers, Conservative Rangers, Russian Rangers, FBI Rangers, Imperial Pimps Rangers, and so on. The adult population was both fearful of, yet simultaneously unwilling to articulate this fear of, the Rangers. Groups of young men, presumably Rangers, could be seen massing in the Scott Elementary schoolyard in the late summer afternoons, or walking 20 or 30 in a group through the area. In time, representatives of the Chicago Boys Club Woodlawn unit approached First Church with the request to use the church's third-floor gymnasium for a project it wanted to run with the conservative Rangers. We granted this request, so we began to see the Rangers up close. We assigned to a member of the congregation, a student just graduated from the University of Chicago and awaiting matriculation at Union Theological Seminary in New York, the task of providing a full history of the Rangers plus an up-to-date analysis of overall organization. The session of the First Church received his report in January 1966 and pondered its possible significance for 2 months. One whole area of significance was right out in the open. It was becoming unsafe for man, woman, or child to be on the streets after 5 in the afternoon as a consequence of the fierce nightly war going on between the Rangers and their rivals, the Devil's Disciples. The high rate of violence was disruptive of elementary community life. Life was swiftly becoming intolerable in Woodlawn. We had the visions of bulldozers crouching on the edge of Woodlawn, all gassed up and ready to level the place. Woodlawn had tipped from solid white to solid black in the 50s. It was about ready to tip into non-existence in 1965 to 1966. People were being shot at and were shooting every night. The Chicago Police Department did not express any official public alarm over the situation. If anything, they were minimizing it. Furthermore, the apparently benevolent city agencies assigned the general task of programming for ghetto youth could not sustain relationships with the Rangers, not because the Rangers thought them too square, but because they perceived them to be on the same side or as identical with the police. In April of 1966, Woodlawn suffered the most violent single month in its history. The young men involved in some of this violence showed every sign of expanding their activities. In that same month, the session of First Church authorized the employment of 2 experienced people, Charles LaPaglia and Robert Keeley, to begin some kind of association with the Rangers, with the direct purpose of ameliorating recent violence. We had little idea of the consequences of that single act. No one else was doing a thing. Something had to be done. May 1966, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference had contacted the Blackstone Rangers. A meeting was planned. I consented to allowing the SCLC to use the First Church's John Knox Hall for the meeting. SCLC showed a CBS kinescope of the Watts riots. The Reverend James Bevel followed with a speech in which he advocated peace between the Blackstone Rangers and the Disciples. He then outlined a program of civil disobedience calculated to bring the city of Chicago to a full halt. Mr. Bevel was more excited by his program than the 400 Rangers who had turned out for the meeting. The numerous plainclothes detectives present noted the nonchalant Ranger reaction, but dutifully made ominous reports of the meeting. Superiors who read the reports seemed to minimize the actual Ranger reaction and to maximize the threat, which a combination of SCLC and the Blackstone Rangers posed to the city. From that moment on, Chicago's officialdom was dedicated to a policy of full heat on the Blackstone Rangers. Charles LaPaglia and Bob Keeley had been feeling out ways to start a programmatic relation with the Rangers, but had scarcely gotten to know the main leaders. There was considerable use of the third floor of the building, especially the gymnasium. No defined program was yet underway. Later that month, police arrested 75 Rangers on disorderly conduct charges arising out of a meeting of no more than 20 of them in a schoolyard, some of them 72 hours after the schoolyard meeting, and some despite ironclad alibis, such as being at work when they were alleged to have been in the schoolyard. This event indicated the new policy. The session voted bail bonds for all arrested Rangers who could not raise the money for themselves. 37 bonds of $25 each were needed. I interceded with Judge Harry Comerford for all 75. The mere acts of providing bond and appearing in court with the Rangers signaled to the police that First Church was involved. They were furious. They had no good words to say for us. They insisted that, had we not interfered, all 75 would have been kept in jail off the streets in the critical summer months when a lot of violence was being anticipated. In several further incidents during June, First Church provided bail bonds. The Rangers began to hold dances on the third floor each weekend. Charles LaPaglia and I were generally available for discussions in my office on the second floor of the church building. Frequently, Ranger leaders would meet in that beautifully appointed room, which featured parquet floors, an oriental rug, and a bank of stained glass windows facing the east. Ranger leaders were asked to confer with U.S. Treasury Department agents and members of the Chicago Police Department for the purpose of arranging a disarmament. As a result, the Rangers did disarm to a significant extent, and all weapons not falling under federal jurisdiction were stored in a large walk-in vault on the second floor of the church building. These weapons were carefully inventoried by the federal and local police authorities. The combination of the safe was known only to two ladies on the church staff, mature women of impeccable character. Yet, 4 months later, these weapons were confiscated in a raid by policemen who pretended they were acting on secret information that guns were in the safe. At least one of the raiders having himself helped to place the weapons there. Our third-party role in the disarmament demonstrated our desire to reduce the general firepower in the area. Ranger leaders maintained that violence reduction was their #1 concern too. In fact, they explained the growth of the organization in that light. They had, so they said, originally banded together to resist the aggression of other boys and establish some basic security. They had encompassed adjacent areas for the purpose of expanding the size of the Ranger enclave, what they referred to as the hood. They had fought when they had to fight in order to maintain the integrity of the hood. They had grown enormously, according to them, not in order to inflict death and pain on others, but to protect themselves. Our steady question in response to this generously mythologized story was, if you are so strong and well organized, why can't you knock off the violence with the D's? To which there was no answer. They would not attempt to give us unbelievable answers. They just had no answer. But the question had force and pertinence. We were not subtly but directly trying to relate the possibilities of their contemporary experience to the mythologized Ranger history. In early August, the Rangers began to present themselves publicly. They picketed the War on Poverty office on August 14th. They secured a package deal from the Youth Welfare Establishment. Representatives from several youth-serving agencies paid for an out-of-town picnic on Bud Billikens Day. The Rangers took the line that if they stayed in town, they would have to go to the parade in force and invite combat, which they did not want. Bob Keeley arranged for the use of the stadium and adjacent facilities at Notre Dame University in South Bend, Indiana, and 900 Rangers spent the day away from trouble. More and more Rangers began using the church building on a regular daily basis. We were having more than 100 Rangers in the building at all times, from early afternoon until curfew, which meant well over 300 Rangers every day. My office became a sort of hub of Ranger activities, especially those activities involving other institutions and city agencies. And during late summer, the Rangers requested use of the main nave and chancel of the church for meetings of the entire nation. This steady and heavy use of the church irritated youth workers in regular established agencies because First Church did not and would not undertake any supervision. It was our desire to place that task squarely on the shoulders of Ranger leaders. Please understand, the Blackstone Rangers had a terrible reputation. Almost without exception, Woodlawn residents hated and feared them. The organization was known to be armed and quick to use firearms and other instruments of violence. Woodlawn residents thus believed that First Church must at least be sanctioning and probably even participating in these activities. The church building had been violence-free. It had suffered far less damage than other institutions which furnished their own supervision, but the apprehension grew. So I wrote a background paper in September for the congregation. This black paper, openly critical of certain practices of the Chicago Police Department and of the policies of the youth-serving agencies, ranks next to the SCLC-sponsored meetings in importance. What had been intended as a clarifying statement designed to relieve apprehension in the First Church family ignited whole new sects of angry discussions on the South Side. The focus was not so much on the content of the paper as on its existence. The business of serving youth is a jungle. Agencies compete fiercely for the finite number of dollars available. They guard their actual programmatic intent carefully in their proposals. Behind such a performance lies the sobering possibility that no hard thought has taken place. Styles are not set simply by consulting the political barometer. The gauge tells them what is possible to do. In other words, eventually the funding sources must check with City Hall. Thus, mere existence of the black paper was a bomb. When Lieutenant Edward Buckney later testified before the McClellan Committee, for instance, he entered the black paper into evidence without further comment. Its mere existence was thought sufficiently damning in itself. Response to the black paper in the congregation was almost wholly favorable, but Woodlawn was riled up. The Woodlawn organization was riled up. Even though there was a steady decrease in actual street-side violence, the case of First Church, working with the Blackstone Rangers, was being prosecuted inside the heads of citizens, and First Church was being pretty consistently found guilty. Not guilty of something criminal, but guilty by association. Therefore, in October, the session called a convocation for the church family. Its purpose was to allow full discussion of the Blackstone Ranger program. I presented a paper. See page 149. The discussion was moderated by Mr. L.D. Jones, a ruling elder in First Church and a brilliant moderator. The paper contained 4 theological principles meant to provide a theological resource to discussion. But discussion did not follow. Many strangers were in attendance. At least one of these was a plainclothes policeman. Others were serving in the South Side agencies. Many did not announce affiliation or name. They spoke vociferously against the program. They asked insinuating questions. Charles LaPaglia, Bob Keeley, and I sought to counter the more grossly misleading statements, but without much success. Members of the congregation with real questions had no opportunity to ask them. The theological principles themselves were not discussed at all. The convocation was a bust. It had been wreaked by the filibustering of vocal, angry, and uncomprehending representatives of the youth welfare establishment, including a policeman. The church building was raided on November 10, 1966. Wide publicity attended the event. First Church was portrayed by police sources as the headquarters for the Blackstone Rangers, as having been used for storing weapons. This was not true, but the best efforts of the staff to present an alternative view were largely unsuccessful. Thus, what had been rumored freely throughout the South Side, because it appeared so prominently in the newspapers and on TV, a fact believed to this day by thousands of residents of metropolitan Chicago. Members of First Church were initially enraged and bewildered by the raid, but from that point on, they began to expose their own uneasiness about the whole program, and particularly the heavy use of the building. Rangers were there morning, noon, and night. They used the first floor, basement, second floor offices, and third floor. Ordinary church meetings had to kind of wedge Rangers out of the rooms in order to begin. There was writing on the walls. The kitchen was occasionally broken into. There was a lot of dirt, mud, snow, ice tracked all over the main halls, plus cigarette butts on the floor and general littering. The restrooms were inevitably messy. Custodial service could not keep up, which was distressing to the congregation. A feeling began to develop from these internal experiences of constant uproar and great numbers of Rangers, and from outside allegations about First Church's being the Ranger headquarters, that the church no longer belonged to the congregation, but to the Rangers instead. Congregational feelings were muted. Still, the issue did not turn into a showdown because the dissenters recognized that First Church was in the midst of an important work. The non-dissenters were ecstatic. They had never belonged to a church with so much booming activity, and no one had ever heard of a church that people broke into if it didn't happen to be open. The Blackstone Rangers had been a small street corner gang, violent, secretive, parochial, just like 100 others in the city or in any other city. But as early as 1965, First Church has seen the Rangers break out of their form. They had developed techniques to curtail violence. On several remarkable occasions, they had come into full public view and made definite public commitments. They were no mere woodlawn organization, but encompassed the entire South Side and were precisely unlike any other youth organization in the city. First Church's programmatic aims, as articulated in the Black Paper, were to reduce violence, to establish relationships between the Rangers and South Side institutions, agencies, and organizations, and to provide social, political, and economic options beyond what the South Side environment could and would provide. By speaking out regularly against police harassment, we became identified by the police as a source of trouble, even criminality, and of independence at least equal to the Rangers themselves. This had the consequence of deflecting some of the official wrath away from the Rangers, while their organization was developing the style and leadership patterns required by their new public position, which was helpful to the Rangers and hard on First Church. It seemed the city was punishing us for what we considered to be the only realistic thing a Christian church could do, namely work for peace, save life, and make war on the structure of disease. But any effort seemed to come under condemnation from the city, and especially the Chicago police, when we provided bail bond. This was construed as a sinister activity, although sanctioned by the Bill of Rights. When we sought to provide legal defense, and at times adequate legal defense, to Rangers, we were treated as though we were assaulting the judicial system itself instead of helping it to function. When we expressed friendship for the Rangers, invited them to our homes, rode in automobiles with them, sat with them in public places, and when we accepted their friendship, visited their homes, attended their weddings, or walked with them down the street, the general community was helped to believe that we had forsaken morality itself. The rumor mill began to churn. The staff of First Church was getting rich off the Rangers. It was getting perverse sexual thrills from the Rangers. It was providing guns, ammunition, and training to the Rangers. It was communist. It was under the dominion of an unnamed white racist located in all places, Madison, Wisconsin, and as his lackeys, the staff was fostering conflict between black boys as a means of population control. To the man on the street, where there was so much smoke, there had to be some fire. In such a context, the report of a shooting incident alleged by the police to be gang-related reinforced the ordinary citizen's estimation of First Church. Many church members were losing friends over this Ranger business and were spending practically all of their time at social events in heated argument. A few church members joined the opposition. The point is that the relevant theological issues were seldom discussed. The pertinent philosophical considerations were simply not entered into because the subject was apt to be, does John Fry have a Swiss bank account? We survived that bitter winter of 1966-67 with hardly any funds, and those funds arriving late, and because late, already committed twice. With real destitution, I mean hunger and frostbite, and with a few valiant lawyers working overtime on a huge volume of cases. We survived on the hope that spring would eventually come, bringing a lot of new possibilities. It did. The Woodlawn Organization, TWO, successfully negotiated the political rapids with its job training program, funded for 1 year at $927,000 from the Demonstration Grants Division of the Washington Office of Economic Opportunity. It specified the employment of Blackstone Ranger and disciple leaders as sub-professionals and provided stipends for job trainees. Although this excellent program was apparently impeded by the gang intelligence unit of the Chicago Police Department and was vigorously fought by youth-serving agencies in the city. Although employers refused to open technical training facilities to job trainees, and although the program has been maligned nationally, it remains the most stirring idea to have come out of the whole war on poverty. Spring brought a $50,000 grant from the Kettering Foundation to First Church expressly to provide Blackstone Ranger leaders time and incentive to develop programs and get them funded. It was an educational grant made on the presupposition that self-determination must be identified, treasured, supported, and its fruits honored. To be sure, most of the grant money was eventually spent on lawyers and for bail bonds, but that grant had a tremendous impact on the Ranger Nation. For out of the planning and education it provided came the organization of a political understanding that to this day represents the Rangers' best hope. Spring also brought the creation and production of a musical revenue called Opportunity Please Knock. When first announced, the Blackstone Rangers with Oscar Brown Jr. present, the revenue was discounted. But it played to SRO crowds the first weekend and thereafter to large and appreciative audiences who paid the going rates to see what one professional reviewer called the best show in town. Up and away, my beautiful balloon. Well, lights ablaze in my beautiful balloon. Well, lights ablaze in my beautiful balloon. We can sing a song and sail along the silver sky. We can
For Jeff Fort and his Black P.1 Nation, the late 1960s was a time when amazing things could happen. Just look and listen.
But the Blackstone Rangers are no longer a tough street gang. They are an example of what can be accomplished by the young people who live in the ghetto areas of our big cities and supposedly have no opportunity to get ahead in life. These kids got off the street and formed a musical revue company called Opportunity Please Knock. And they've been performing now for almost a year. I'm sure you're going to enjoy what they do. Ladies and gentlemen, meet the Blackstone Rangers.
In fact, these weren't Blackstone Rangers at all. They were simply the people Jeff Fort sent to L.A. to sing on the Smothers Brothers show. Once again, he controlled the situation.
They were poor. They didn't have anything. They didn't run any candy stores or cleaning shops.
They wanted to be somebody?
And they wanted to run it. That was their term. They wanted to run it.
Oscar Brown Jr., singer, songwriter, playwright, was born in Woodlawn.
Nobody wants to be broken, poor, beating everybody up and scared to death all the time. That's what it was about. They were scared of people. They were scared of each other. They were scared of what was going on, and they were scared of the environment in general. And so they became tough. They became something that was going to fight back. They were getting something that was going to run it. That had its own turf and it had its own identity, stone thing.
Oscar Brown Jr.'s idea to stem the violence in Woodlawn was to create a musical revue starring the Blackstone Rangers, providing them with an alternative to the street. It was an idea that allowed Oscar Brown Jr. to look more closely at Jeff Fort.
He reminded me of a very good, charismatic Baptist preacher in his approach to these guys. Brothers, where did you get those hats? I mean, wear those for your chief. He was like that. And he was an inspirational guy to him. I never got to see that in my general dealings with him because he was always usually pretty reticent. He was not a warm person in my relationship with him.
Oscar Brown Jr. is still writing and performing.
These kids are Americans. They see the same thing everybody else sees. They see Ivan Boesky, They see the whole scam that's worked all around. They want to be in on something big. I mean, these kids were the victims of something beyond them. They were born victims. They were in it. They were black and poor in America in Woodlawn when they found themselves.
It caught Chicago unawares. The music, staging, dancing, costuming, singing were first class. The ideology was simple and powerful. The cast and crew were paid amply each week during its 6-week run. The initial debt contracted for costumes and lighting equipment was paid off, and a great many citizens were forced to make some re-evaluations of the Blackstone Rangers. Momentum developed along with the greater hopefulness. The Rangers played a cool hand during these tense summer days when riots were going off in Newark and Detroit. They had negotiated a truce with the disciples that was holding up. Violence in Woodlawn was down to zero, but the Chicago police looked upon the TWO program, the Kettering Grant, and Opportunity Please Knock as unqualified disasters because they brought money to gang members. And when gang kids have money, they cause trouble, despite prevailing evidence that the money was having the opposite effect. So operating on that fire.
You got a big mouth.
This is the I be talking about.
A big mouth.
Half rapping.
You got a big mouth.
Game. You think it's so
a big mouth. A big mouth.
Come on.
That's the way it was. It happened so naturally. Did not know it was now. Next thing I think was you holding me close.
Fellas, I'm ready to get up and do my thing.
I let myself go. Now I'm flying through the stars.
I want to get into it, man, you know. Moving, doing it, you know. Can I count it off? 1, 2, 3, 4.
I've been waiting for you. It's been so long. I knew just what I'm gonna do when I heard your song. Fill my heart with a kiss. Gave me freedom. You think I couldn't die prisons. I needed someone.
People in the house. Turn your radio up. Now listen, y'all, it is start time.
I'd like to know, are you really ready for some super dynamite soul?
There's a rumor being spread about me and the crew, about something we are supposed to do.
Fellas! Look at you. That sure enough feel good. I know the job feel good too. But we sure coming through that thing. See, this other cat's afraid to get down like this.
There's nothing I won't do. Anything you want me to do.
We're gonna show you how we do it for 85 Ticket Live.
When you hold me in your arms, you touch my body with the charms, and I just don't give it on my heart. I don't see you every day, but in my own way, I love you. Oh, it really makes me wanna pray. Sweet and nice, my love.
And my present play procrastinates my plea, so I'm the perfect pacemaker, perpetrators pray.
The police got cracking as soon as Labor Day had safely passed. Ranger leaders were arrested on an assortment of charges, from armed robbery to rape and murder. The charges seemed to the Rangers and First Church staff to be largely frame-ups. Job training centers were harassed, as were staff members of First Church and TWO personnel. The winter of 1967-68 was hard in its own way because our energies were drawn away from creative, positive work and used up in strictly defensive actions. I would estimate that the Rangers lost their chance for $5 million in new programs. Instead of planning, they were in jail or commuting to court. In June 1968, it became clear to us that Senator McClellan was preparing to conduct a thorough investigation. However, we had no idea just how sensationalist this investigation might be. Since First Church's involvement in the job training program had been minimal, we assumed that we might be asked just a few questions about our participation. In other words, the terms of the lease agreement we had with TWO for the use of the third floor of the church for one of the training centers. Instead, we discovered that we were the target, or made to appear the target, the better, in order to wipe out TWO's program. So, there before the whole country, and the material which had been floating around the South Side as rumors was presented as evidence. If any of those witnesses opposed the First Church had given their testimony without the immunity accorded them by the Senate rules, especially in a court of law, they would either have been laughed out of court or sentenced to 312 years in jail for misrepresentation. But they did have immunity. Therefore, they safely made their outrageous allegations, smiling all the way. Attempts on our part to rebut were stifled. We were not allowed to cross-examine adverse witnesses and thereby show up the incredible inconsistencies and inanities, the malice and lack of substantiation that were so plain to us who were forced to listen. That warning to the churches of the land, "Be good or we will bust you," has not come true. First Church is not busted. It has scars. It is weaker in resources because of the enduring hostility of Chicago Police Department. But it is still going and is unimaginably stronger for having lived through that experience.